When you study categorical logic, you typically study a number of what are called immediate inferences. That is, inferences from one categorical proposition type to another. Included in the set of immediate inferences that we learn in categorical logic are obversion, conversion, and contraposition. What are these? Well, these are, as I said, immediate inferences, but there's a specific sort of immediate inference. In other words, they are immediate inferences made by manipulating the logical structure of a proposition. Each manipulation involves one or more steps. What we're looking to see when we obvert, convert, or contrapose a proposition is whether or not the resulting proposition is equivalent to the original. That is, whether or not the resulting proposition says logically the same thing as the original. If it does, the two statements, the two propositions are equivalent, and so you can validly infer one from the other. If they are not equivalent, then you cannot validly infer one from the other. Let's take a closer look. First, let's define obversion. When we obvert a claim, we change the quality of the proposition and we add the complement to the predicate. Now, I'm assuming that you know what the quality of a proposition is and what the complement of a term is. If not, go back and review some of the introductory material on categorical propositions. In addition, take a look at the video tutorial on the complement of a term. If you don't want to do either of those things, you'll see by way of our discussion here what it means to change the quality of a proposition and what it means to add the complement to a term. The next thing we want to see is whether or not when we obvert a proposition, our inference is valid. And the answer is yes. Obversion is a valid inference not only for all four proposition types, universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, and particular negative, but also on both interpretations of the universal, that is, both assuming and not assuming existential import. What does it mean to assume existential import? That means that we assume there is at least one member of the subject class in a universal claim. Let's take a look at some examples and then our Venn diagrams for obversion. Here are some examples. All S are P when obverted becomes no S are non-P. Take a look at the examples before moving on. No S are P becomes all S are non-P. Again, take a look at the examples before moving on. Some S are P becomes some S are not non-P. Take a look at the examples before moving on. Finally, some S are not P becomes some S are not non-P. Once again, take a look at the examples before moving on. Notice that each of the examples begins with the original claim, and then I provide one or more examples of the obversion of that claim. In some cases, I provide two examples of the original claim and two examples of the obverted claim. I do this so that the example types give you a way of thinking about obversion that may resonate with you more than another way. In each case, though, we do have logically equivalent structures. Now let's take a look at the Venn diagram. All right, let me show you what you're looking at here. On the left side, that is, of the two sets of Venn diagrams, the left diagram is the original. That's why I'm drawing a red arrow pointing to the left diagram in each set. The left diagram is the original. Notice that the right diagram in each case, that is, the right diagram on the A proposition that assumes existential import, the right diagram on the E proposition that assumes existential import, the right diagram on the left proposition that does not assume existential import, the right diagram on the the right diagram under the E proposition's modern interpretation, and then the right diagram under, respectively, the I and O propositions are identical to their original. That shows us that the logical structure of an obverted claim is identical to the original claim. So whether we're talking about a universal affirmative, a universal negative, whether we're assuming that at least one member of the subject class in a universal claim exists or not, and whether or not we're asserting that at least one S is a P or at least one S is not a P, we see that the diagrams are equivalent. That means you can infer an obverted proposition from its original. More specifically, that inference is valid. Now, conversion also involves the manipulation of a proposition. It's not the case, however, that the inference is valid for all four claim types. Let's take a look. First, what you do with conversion is you switch the subject and predicate position. Next, you evaluate. Notice that things are a little more complicated here. I hope it's the case that the examples I provide, as well as the discussions of the Venn diagrams, help you make sense of why it is that some propositions, when converted, are not equivalent to their original, or is equivalent to the original by a limiting factor. So first, E propositions are validly converted on both interpretations of the universal. The I proposition is validly inferred from the original by conversion. The A proposition must first be limited. That is, you must first infer the I proposition from the A, then you can convert it and get an equivalent proposition. But that's only on the traditional interpretation. Next, the A proposition cannot be validly converted on the modern interpretation, and the O proposition cannot be validly converted. Let's see how this plays out with our examples and then our diagrams. All SRP becomes all PRS. Go ahead and take a look at the examples before moving on. No SRP becomes no PRS. Once again, take a look at the examples before moving on. Some SRP becomes some PRS. Look at the examples before moving on. And finally, some S are not P becomes some P are not S. Once again, take a look at the examples before moving on. You'll notice that the second sentence in each pair for the universal affirmative and the particular negative is not equivalent to the first. So let's look at the universal affirmative examples. All dogs are animals. All animals are dogs. Here's another way to think about the conversion. If it's a dog, then it's an animal, is the original claim. The conversion is, if it's an animal, then it's a dog. Now drop down to the O proposition. At least one animal is not a chicken. The converted claim is at least one chicken is not an animal. I hope you can see by the examples that the two converted propositions, that is the A and the O, are not equivalent to their respective originals. Now let's take a look at the examples in terms of let's take a look at the Venn diagrams so you can see a visual representation of the logical structure. Once again, for the universals, we have at the top the assumption of existential import, and on the bottom, the modern interpretation, that is the Venn diagrams that do not assume existential import. Notice that on the left, for each pair, is the original, and on the right, for each pair, is the converted proposition. And you can see how the A proposition's converted Venn does not look like the original. And that's on both interpretations. Notice that on the E proposition conversion example, on the E proposition converted Venns, we do have a diagram that is equivalent to the original. That's also the case with the I proposition, but notice that it's not the case with the O. When the diagrams do not look like their originals, it's not going to be the case that you can validly convert the proposition and as a result have an equivalent or identical diagram. Now let's talk about how it is that the traditional or Aristotelian interpretation of the universal, that is, how it is that the A proposition that assumes at least one member of the subject class exists allows by limitation, that is, allows by the inference to the subaltern, that is the I proposition, a valid conversion. Well, we know from the square of opposition that on the Aristotelian interpretation, that is, on the traditional interpretation of the universal, the A proposition contains the I. So by subalternation, another way to put it is, by limiting the A to the I, we can validly make the inference by conversion. So we say that on the traditional interpretation, the A limited to the I yields a valid conversion. That's because we already know that the I proposition can be converted and the inference is valid. Lastly, let's look at contraposition. You can think about contraposition and conversion as mirror inferences. Recall that conversion is valid for E and I propositions. Contraposition is valid for A and O propositions. There are two steps to contraposition, not one. It's that second step that makes contraposition valid for A and O. So the steps are as follows. Switch the subject and predicate positions. Add the complement to each. The evaluations are as follows. On both interpretations, contraposition is valid for the A proposition. Contraposition is also valid for the O proposition. Contraposition is valid by limitation for the E on the traditional interpretation. It is not valid for the E proposition on the modern interpretation, and contraposition is not valid for the I proposition. Let's read through some examples and then once again look at the relevant Venn diagrams. All S are P becomes all non-P are non-S. Read the examples before moving on. No S or P becomes no non-P or non-S. Again, read the examples before moving on. Some S or P becomes some non-P or non-S. Read the examples before moving on. And finally, some S or not P becomes some non-P or not non-S. Once again, read the examples before moving on. Notice that the second sentence in each pair for the E proposition and the I proposition is not equivalent to the first. Let's take a look at each example in a little bit of detail, precisely because you might feel like you're playing a little bit of mental twister with all the negations flying around. I hope, however, that the examples resonate with you and that when we look at the Venn diagrams, you can import that level of confidence. First, all S or P becomes all non-P or non-S. All dogs are animals, so all non-animals are non-dogs. In other words, if it's a dog, it's an animal. So if it's not a dog, it's not an animal. No S or P becomes no non-P or non-S. Yeah, this one's a little bit tricky, but hold on and I think you'll see that it's not as difficult as it first appears. No hearts are livers, no non-livers are non-hearts. In other words, if it's a heart, then it's not a liver. But it doesn't follow that if it's not a liver, it's not a heart. Next, some S or P becomes some non-P or non-S. At least one assessment is a term paper. At least one non-term paper is a non-assessment. Now you might say that both of these sentences are true, but just because they both may be true doesn't mean that one validly follows from the other by contraposition. When we look at the Venn diagram, I hope that'll be clear to you. But let's move on to our last example, and then we'll look at our Venns. Some buildings are not apartments, so some non-apartments are not non-buildings. In other words, if it's true that at least one building is not an apartment, it follows that at least one thing that's not an apartment is a building. Once again, here is the layout that we're now used to for our Venn diagrams. I want to point your attention to the E proposition and the I proposition. So notice that the area outside of the S and P classes is shaded on each interpretation of the universal. What we're saying is this: whatever is not a P is also not an S. In other words, we're talking about the area that has nothing to do with either S or P, but we don't know what is in that area, right? Because it's not been specified by a class. Now take a look at the I proposition. When we say some S or P, we're saying there's at least one thing that is an S and a P. That's why the X is in the area of overlap between S and P. But when we say there is at least one non-P that's also not an S, or in the example of the Venn that I'm giving you, we have A and B as the circles. So there is one non-B that's also not an A. We're again talking about the area outside of these two classes, but there's no specification of what class or classes are in that area, right? Because the proposition is supposed to be about S and P classes or A and B classes. So when we're talking about things outside of each of those classes, now we're in a completely uncategorized area, if you will. I hope this brief tutorial helps you comprehensively answer the question, what are obversion, conversion, and contraposition?